Welcome to the latest episode of Diplomat Risk Intelligence's monthly webinar. For our viewers across the world, this webinar is being recorded and will be available on the Diplomat's YouTube channel early next week. My name is Abhi Reg. I'm the DRI's Director of Research and the Security and Defense Editor at the Diplomat. One of the most remarkable developments over the past 5 years or so is the extent to which Australia has emerged as a leading strategic actor in the Asia-Pacific or the Indo-Pacific, as the current fashionable terminology puts it. Once derided by regional wags as America's deputy sheriff in the region, in the recent years, Canberra has adopted an assertive foreign policy posture and squarely challenged the long-held precept that its deep economic ties with China will preclude it from staunchly guarding against security threats emanating from Beijing. Witness, but for a few examples, it's Australia's membership in the Quad and various infrastructure and climate trilaterals, including one that was just recently announced, and its new and stringent counter foreign interference laws. And finally, adoption of a robust defense posture that focuses on long-range strike capabilities. And as the recently announced AUKUS partnership demonstrates, desire to transform the country into a frontline power capable of resisting Chinese aggression into the Western Pacific and beyond, and shape events far away from its shores. But while Australia's recent hard-edged security posture is what drives the headlines across the region and agitates the imagination of the Indo-Pacific strategic commentariat, it is not immediately clear where the country, whose leading defense intellectuals define it as a middle power, is headed in the long run, politically, diplomatically, and in general in terms of where it sees itself as an actor beyond a security actor, as a political actor, both in the Indo-Pacific and in the world at large. For example, where does Canberra stand on questions of global governance, including climate change? Where does it stand on its relations with Southeast Asia on one hand, and Indian Ocean behemoth India on the other? And finally, what does a new modus vivendi between Australia and China look like, if such a modus vivendi is indeed possible? To discuss all these questions and more, the latest edition of DRI Majlis will be joined by 3 leading experts who have an established track record of keenly probing Australia's role in the world. Ms. Kate Clayton is a research officer at Latrobe Asia and Chief Operations Officer at Young Australians in International Affairs. An international relations academic, her research areas include Australia, China, the Pacific Islands, and the United States. Her focus is on security, geopolitics, international relations theory, climate change, gender, and sexuality. Dr. Ian Hall is a professor of international relations at the Griffith University and co-editor of the Australian Journal of International Affairs. One of the world's leading experts on Australia-India relations, Dr. Hall is the author of the critically acclaimed Modi and the Reinvention of Indian Foreign Policy that was published by Bristol University Press in 2019. And finally, we're joined by Dr. Erin Watson-Lynn, who's an international relations practitioner and foreign affairs commentator. After over a decade in some of Australia's leading universities and think tanks, Erin now consults across the globe and through her portfolio of projects. Erin is currently an Australian delegate to the G20 Women Summit, previously was head delegate to the Saudi Arabia W20 Summit, and represented Australia at G20 meetings in Japan, Argentina, China, and Turkey. Welcome to DRI Majlis, Kate, Ian, and Erin. Let me start with you. So we'll do this alphabetically in terms of questions, in terms of opening remarks. So let me start last name alphabetically. So let me start with you, Kate. If you could first give us a sense of where Australia-China relations are headed. I mean, we all have read the headlines, we all know the broad story, but I want to know from you whether a possibility of a negotiated compromise on both sides is possible, as remote as many may consider that to be. That would be one one question I would like to ask you to address in your opening remarks. The second part that I want to ask you is, where does Australia stand on climate change, right? And could that issue emerge as a bridge between Beijing and Canberra? Because some would argue that Australia's approach towards China has become overtly securitized. So could there be a degree of desecuritization of the relationship through climate change as a bridge that brings the two together? But most importantly, I think, at least from my perspective, what I want to know from you is, how do emerging foreign policy leaders such as yourself view the overall direction of Australian foreign policy in general and Canberra's stance towards China in particular?
Fantastic. Thanks so much for the introduction and for having me on. Really looking forward to hearing what Ian and Erin are going to say, as well as two people that I really look up to in this space. But I'm kind of going to focus, as you said, on Australia, China, particularly climate change. I'm very much looking at COP26 at the moment. But I think moving to the future of Chinese-Australian relations is, I think, things are better than last year. You know, last year it was kind of the lowest of low for Australian-China relations in history. We kind of saw the domestic politics of each state retrospectively get entwined with how they conduct their foreign policy. So we look at the 14 grievances from last year, for example, and the kind of language that was used in that was far more aimed at Chinese domestic audiences than any diplomats or kind of foreign relations experts here in Australia. We look at the breaking of the Belt and Road MOU in Victoria as well, kind of got caught up in domestic state versus federal relations. Yes, it was a part of broader Australia-China relations, but we kind of look at the more micro causes of these relationships. And I think last year we saw this massive shift away from more operational policies. So there wasn't so much a policy change at the operational level between Australia and China, but the kind of declarations that states were making on both sides really heated up. And I think that was kind of one of the long-term effects of a Trumpian presidency. It's this kind of Twitter diplomacy by phrases as opposed to policy. And I think we've seen that die down this year quite a lot. I think at the end of last year, everyone was quite pessimistic about the future relations. And I don't think they've gotten better per se. I think it's just kind of stabilized and they haven't gotten worse. And I think that's kind of the main thing when we're looking at the future of foreign policy. And I think what this year kind of encapsulates is kind of the year of the United States. We've seen the Biden presidency and that's renewed focus in terms of climate change, how that matches with COP. We have the 70th anniversary of the ANZUS alliance as well. We have AUKUS, a kind of reinvigorated Quad with 2 Quad meetings this year. So I think this year, Australian foreign policy experts and elites are kind of much more focused on the United States as opposed to China. And I think that that's going to enable us to kind of maneuver our foreign policy in a much more confident way, because we're increasing our relations with other states in the region, the Quad, with the ASEAN Comprehensive Agreement today as well. So I think Australia, off the back of last year, has become a much more confident and independent foreign policy actor, in that we saw the trade tariffs and how kind of quickly Australia bounced back from that for such a smaller state. I think it's quite impressive because we don't necessarily have the geo-economic structure to kind of exist as an independent actor within these because of our reliance on China, for example. And I think because we could so quickly, you know, not remove, but kind of change who our export partners were with Southeast Asia, with Latin America. So I think moving into 2021, there's some hope. And then we turn to COP, much less hope compared to what we've had recently. We saw the recent 2050 net zero emissions by the Scott Morrison government. And again, as I said, much more of a declaratory policy. There wasn't much of kind of operational policy shift within that. But I also think it's important to note that the states in Australia have had net zero 50-50 emissions this year and for the last couple of years. So whilst kind of at the federal level, climate politics are quite stalled, I think at the state level, there is some hope in terms of what we do with climate policy. And I think that's potentially where Australia, China have the kind of most amounts of collaboration in the relationship. But I also think that's going to depend quite heavily on how how the US and China are at COP. I think we're going to kind of look to the US to guide us in terms of how we manage China and how we manage climate change. It's such a big pillar. We see that China released their kind of energy emission changes within the last 48 hours. She won't be at COP, but they're sending their climate envoy, who has a really long history of working quite well with John Kerry, the US climate envoy, at Paris. So I think that's a good sign for kind of acts of goodwill moving into climate change And I think if it goes well with the US and China, it will go well with Australia and China. And we saw last year in November, the Australia Climate Green Energy Fund donated 9.8 million, not donated, gave a loan of 9.8 million to Chinese Sunman, which is this kind of solar power panel that makes them more accessible. And that was November 2020 last year, kind of at the height of this turmoil relations, but the people to people, the business relations were still able to function because they view these kind of domestic and international relations issues quite separately. So I think the day-to-day function of Australia-China relations isn't going to change so much, but it kind of depends on the declaratory at the top level. And I think there's potential to hope, but I think that's going to mostly depend on the United States and China and kind of their more broadly. But I think moving into kind of next generation's perceptions of foreign policy in Australia is, I think in regards to the China relationship, there's a lot of hope. We look at the Julie Bishop government had the fantastic kind of reinvigorating of the new Colombo plan. So most of Australian students who are going on exchange are going to China, and they're increasingly picking China over the United States. And that kind of shift in our people to people and network and soft power relations is going to be increasingly important. Young Australians are far more skeptical of the United States. They don't think we should drop the alliance. I don't think Australia should. I'm quite pro-alliance in that respect. I think it's really important to our economic and security and kind of all facets of how we conduct our policy. But I think there's just going to be an increasing multilateralism. And I think we've seen that this year, increasing relations with the UK, with the US as well, with Japan, South Korea, ASEAN, Indonesia. I think we're kind of seeing Australia look elsewhere for its foreign policy. And I think that's also seen as well. One of the things that you mentioned was the securitization of the China relationship. And I don't think we've securitized the China relationship exclusively compared to how we've securitized other relationships. I think we've kind of seen Australia invest more in its defense forces than it has its diplomats. And I think that's going to mean that our security ties with these relations, again, we saw AUKUS, this kind of, Anglospheric nuclear subs, information sharing, technology sharing, which is something Australia really needs, is these capabilities and a kind of basic level to defend ourselves. But that kind of saw the diplomatic cause kind of left out in those discussions, and that damaged our relationships with France, for example, which are kind of a key pillar of security and stability in the Antarctic region, as well as the Pacific region. So I think making sure, I think young leaders are increasingly looking to other states to kind of maintain Australia's relations. And I think that's good to kind of release the old Menzies phase of reliance on great and powerful friends. If we're kind of expanding our networks, and that's what the Indo-Pacific is at its basic core, is this expansion of kind of multilateralism and the rules-based order. It's free and open. It's kind of this much more inclusive concept of what Australian foreign policy is. And I think that's the key shift this year, is that we're kind of less focusing on the damage to the Australia-China relationships, and we're looking to these other networks to expand our relations.
Thank you so much, Kate, for very, very insightful remarks. And I appreciated your perspective on how young Australians are looking at where things are headed. Because in many ways, when I look at Australia's role as a strategic actor, I look at it at a much longer frame. So 20 years, 25 years. And so these views become very important. I should add a point here, and this is an advertisement as well as a remark, which is that we're not going to talk AUKUS. And the only reason why we are not going to talk AUKUS is that I recorded a podcast with Ewan Graham yesterday on AUKUS alone, which is going to be released this afternoon, right after the webinar. So today is the DRI's Australia Day. So I thought we'll club both of them. But there's also a lot larger issue, and which brings me to you, Ian, which is in terms of what Kate's raised, that a lot of young Australians, I suspect a lot of not so young Australians as well, will prefer a much more diverse basket of relationships. And one of the things, Ian, you have studied very well, is Australia's relationship with India. By the way, I think Ian is one of the few people I know who's not an Indian or who's not from New Delhi, who knows Delhi bookshops as well as I do, which is saying something. So Ian, you're an expert on this. Let me just ask you something. Can you summarize for us what the driving forces are behind the deepening ties between Australia and India. We know the effects. We know we know the optics, we know the agreements, we know the 2+2s, we know all of these things. But what are the fundamental driving forces that are shaping that relationship? That's one. But more importantly, what I want to ask you is that if you remove China from the equation, will the relationship come unglued? In other words, is China all said and done what holds the relationship together? That would be the first set of the first complex of questions I would like to pose to you. The second one is going to be a little tricky, but I know you have written an entire book on this, so it shouldn't be that hard for you, which is, how is Canberra seeking to balance its professed commitments to liberal democracies around the world with what many, including Australians, I should add, perceive as rising Hindu majoritarianism within Modi's India? So between principles and pragmatism, where does Canberra stand? And finally, I want you to describe a little bit about the negatives in the India-Australia relationship. What are the key irritants? And the question whether rhetoric has often outpaced on-ground developments.
Well, no, thank you, Abhi. Thanks for the invitation to come and talk this afternoon, my time, and also to be able to interact with both Kate and Erin. It's very nice to see the two of them as well. So you've asked a whole series of quite tricky questions. I don't think there's much doubt that China has acted, or concerns about China has acted as a catalyst in pulling Australia and India together. There's no doubt that all of the progress that's been made, or most of the progress that's been made in the bilateral relationship over the last 15 years or so, has been very much on the defense and security and political side of things. And it's hard to imagine that happening had China not been in the equation, and if China had not become increasingly assertive over that period of time, leading to mounting concern in both capitals, leading to more and more cooperation between the two. And in fact, if you look at the bilateral relationship, as I've had a chance to do, at the moments at which you see these peaks of concern is the moment at which you see activism, particularly on the Australian side, to engage India on these political security and defense issues. So one of the major drivers in this relationship has been China, really. If we go, and if we look earlier than that, Australia has always looked at India as being important and to be taken seriously, and a kind of major player in international affairs and so on, but has never really seen the need to engage India as fulsomely and enthusiastically. It's kind of engaged it fitfully, usually with some sort of economic motive in mind. It's been respectful, but really the relationship has not moved particularly fast. And occasionally we fall out with each other, as it did in 1998 over the nuclear tests. But then since then, because of China, the relationship has been pulled together. I actually think now, though, there's enough, well, Nick Bisley uses the word ballast. There's enough ballast in the relationship. And when Nick talks normally about trade and economic ties, there is enough trade and investment flowing in both directions. It's not at the same level as the economic relationship we have with China, but there is substantial trade and bilateral investment flowing in both directions. But there's other ballast in the relationship too. There's a much better understanding of each other's positions in the region. There's also a mutual, I think, growing recognition that we are moving towards a kind of a multipolar Asia in which it's not just going to be about China-US relations, or it's not simply going to be about China as a hegemon. Instead, there are going to be multiple players, and they all need to be engaged respectively. They all respectfully. They all need to have their interests taken into account. And I think there's a kind of growing sense. Kate's talked about younger people kind of feeling that sense that the region is changing, and that we've got to engage with it in a different kind of way. And I completely agree with that. I think that's right. And then the other thing, of course, is that we now have a substantial Indian origin diaspora in Australia, numbering, it's a bit difficult to put an exact number on it, but perhaps 700,000 heading. It will be heading very rapidly towards 1 million people. Erin knows a lot more about this than I do, but this diaspora matters. It's visible. It has changed Australia in ways that I very much appreciate. I first came to Australia, I'm British originally, in 2006. There were not that many people of Indian origin here then, and now in 2021, 15 years later, there are Indian shops, there are Indian business people, there's Indian investment, India is present in Australia in a way that it wasn't before. So that's the ballast that's going to keep this relationship going. It still needs a lot of maintenance though, and we need to be able to manage disagreements. It needs a lot of maintenance because of the asymmetry in the relationship. India is a huge country, Australia is not. Australia's population is, the population of Mumbai. It is, yeah, of course, it's a significant economic player in the region. Australia is a rich nation. It also has significant military power and all of that, but it's not a peer to India, and it's not a country that is an easy, natural partner, I think, for India. And India doesn't look upon Australia necessarily as being the same as, say, Japan, which has significant weight in the region and has a lot of affinity for it. So there's one issue, the asymmetry. The other issue is going to be this, I think, this question about democracy and so on. We talk a lot about shared values. I think we have to be honest about the fact that majoritarianism, Hindu majoritarianism in India does provoke some concern in Australia. It also occasionally manifests on Australian streets. We see, as we have a greater diaspora population, disagreements within the diaspora become much more visible, and they have been visible on the streets of Melbourne and Sydney and elsewhere. But over the farmer protests have spilled over into other countries, including Australia, and we've seen a little bit of some problems on the streets as a consequence of that. So it's becoming much more visible, and one of the problems we need to manage there is Australia doesn't know India particularly well. So yes, a lot of Australians go to China, go to Hong Kong on study trips. They know Southeast Asia incredibly well. But if you look at the number of Australians who actually go to India, it's very small. And we don't have a big cultural reservoir of mutual understanding on which to draw. Okay, unlike, say, actually Canada, because of its much bigger diaspora, much longer, deeper rooted diaspora, the United Kingdom and elsewhere, they have much more complex, longer histories than we do. And most Australians have not been to India and don't know India very well. So there's going to be some misunderstanding and some problems there. And I think as well, too, a Hindu majoritarianism that became more overtly anti-Muslim would pose some problems in the diplomatic relationship. The other issue here, of course, is trade. We are an outward-looking trading country. We believe in free markets and low tariffs and all of those sorts of things. That's not true of India. We would have liked to have seen India remain within the regional comprehensive economic partnership, and India pulled out. That was a bit of a shock, and it was a disappointment to Canberra as well. We would like to have a proper free trade deal, not just a comprehensive economic cooperation agreement, a proper free trade deal with low tariffs in all areas. But I think, whereas 10 years ago, that was a significant irritant, now Canberra is much more realistic about the prospect of those things, or rather the very small possibility that those things will manifest. And I think Canberra understands that it is extremely difficult for India to move towards the kind of market-oriented trading nation type model that Australia has valued since the 1980s, at least. And so we can work on other areas of cooperation. And one of those is you've highlighted the Indian Ocean. There's security cooperation that can be done there, but there's also things around fisheries, around trying to clean up the oceans, about environmental issues, about how we deal with small island states, which we have a lot of experience in the Pacific, and I know India does too in the Indian Ocean. So there's a whole range of other areas in which we might be able to cooperate that I think are going to be productive as we move forward. And I haven't even talked about some of the other things that we're working on, closely together, things like the cybersecurity partnerships that have grown up just very rapidly in the last few years. And there's a big cybersecurity summit happening in Sydney in the next few days that is going to be addressed by Indian Prime Minister. So I'll stop there because I suspect I've probably gone over time, but thanks so much for the invitation.
Thank you so much, Ian, for a number of very thoughtful remarks and very candid remarks, which I appreciate, and I'm sure our audience will appreciate as well. I have to now bring in an anecdote. Well, two anecdotes actually, because related to Australia. One is that the first time I visited Australia, it was actually Ian's invitation to Brisbane. I discovered that the population of the Indian National Capital Region, which includes Gurgaon, an outskirt of Delhi where I now live, and other parts around the national capital, that population is around, give or take, 22 million, which I believe is Australia's population. And it blew my mind. And frankly, that was one thing that blew my mind. That's one. The second is on the issue of FTA. And I've always maintained that I support Australia in the FTA for a very simple reason. I like Australian wines. They're very expensive in India. I would like to have more Australian wine. So that's my personal stake in the Australia in the FTA. But moving to you, Erin, you have been long involved with multilateral organizations as a non-governmental delegate and in other capacities. How do you assess Australia's overall approach towards global governance? And I just don't mean just on the issue of climate change. I mean things like migration. I mean things like cooperation on other forms, essentially. HADR. I know HADR is already securitized enough so that the maritime folks, the maritime space people, they take care of that. But what is Australia's overall approach towards global governance? That would be my first question. My second question is going to be tricky, or maybe not, and which is that, to what extent do you think Australian foreign policy can be congruent to that of the United States? Because both are, after all, treaty allies, and very solid treaty allies at that. And yet, Australia can preserve a degree of policy independence. Because you have seen that happen last year around the time when there were calls for an independent investigation into the origins of the COVID-19 pandemic. So there was a degree of I wouldn't call it discord, but sort of somewhat divergent positions between Washington and Canberra. That's my second thing. And finally, I want to touch on something that or ask you about something that Ian touched on, and which is the Sydney Dialogue, which is going to happen on November 17th, I believe. Tell us about Australia's desire to emerge as an emerging tech leader with things like the Sydney Dialogue being hosted. A lot of excellent track 1.5 work is being done by ASPE, including some Indian think tanks also. But why this sudden focus on emerging and new technologies? And again, is it the China factor alone?
Well, thank you very much, and really appreciate the invitation here today, and fabulous to have Kate and Ian speak before me as well. Lots of things you were saying, I had lots of ideas and I was writing them down as I was going, so I might link back to some of them as well. But before I start, I actually just want to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands on which I'm zooming into you all from today, which is something I often like to do at the beginning of events. So it's the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation here in North Melbourne, where I live. So, and also pay my respect to their elders, past and present, but also Indigenous people all around the world, and especially anyone who is listening in today. So 3 really big and important questions that I could talk about forever, particularly the multilateral organisations and multilateral institutions question. You mentioned in your very kind introduction that I've been involved with the G20, particularly the engagement groups. And I've been collecting and observing and talking late into the night last night, in fact, to one of your colleagues, Ian, at Griffith Asia Institute about the G20 and Australia's role in the G20 and what it is that we're doing out there and how we can be better, put it that way. So I guess when I speak about multilateral institutions, I speak, as you mentioned, from the non-government perspective. So I've never been an official, I've never been on a track 1 dialogue. I sit in those track 2 engagement groups, or 1.5 engagement groups, whose role is really to get out there and lobby as much as we can, although lobby I think is a dirty word, but as much as we can to try and influence international policy on a whole range of areas that you mentioned. So, you know, in the G20, I specifically deal with gender, but we also deal with tech, digital issues, migration, inclusive finance, and so on. And you have all of these other engagement groups that try to do the same. Now you can go and read up on those engagement groups, but I think going to your question about Australia in these organisations is actually, we don't really show up that well in these track 2 organisations. And I think that they have a really important place in the G20 system and can be very influential if we were able to invest better in our role in these and we leverage these institutions better. So one thing I often say to people who are interested in this space is just turn up, because there's probably not another Australian delegate going. And I can touch on a range of issues as to why that is. But things like the W20, there's a handful of delegates that go each year. The Business 20, if you wanted to turn up and get involved in a task force, you can. These things are open for the taking. But people don't, and APEC's the same. There's lots of APEC engagement groups and so on that you can get involved with, and Australia doesn't tend to show up. But a big part of that, I think, is that it's really underfunded. And it's an expensive exercise, and it's something that requires a lot of, I guess that, you know, there's an element of personality involved there too on the individual. But think tanks in Australia, we've got this growing community of think tanks, which is great, but there's a finite amount of money in the country. You know, we are a rich country, but at the same time, amount of money that's being put into think tanks and the money that people can go out and source to engage in track 2 activities. So when you've got such a finite amount of money, if an organisation is successful in getting it, are they going to spend it on the G20? I don't know. Are they going to spend it on something else? Maybe. If it aligns with one of those thematic areas, possibly. But a lot of this is on the onus of people being able to, you know, get out there and actually get themselves to these dialogues and try and influence policy from that Australian perspective. So what you do see from other countries, though, is where a member state will go to a presidency and offer funding to help support initiatives. Australia's not doing that. And it's a really big missed opportunity, I think, for our role in a broader global governance environment, which those non-state actors are increasingly important. So I guess just to link that to one of the question that you had around Australian foreign policy in the United States. And I'm someone who's done a lot of work with the US and US government here. I agree with Kate's comments, you know, the alliance is good. Don't think it's a bad thing. But when you link that then to the broader global governance system, and I'll use the G20 as an example again, is that I'm not out there best friends with the other US delegates and collaborating with them or coalescing with them on ideas or logistics or diplomacy. In fact, we don't really have a whole lot in common often. Sometimes from a policy we might have in common, personality-wise, not always. Again, it does depend on the delegates, but what we find is we find ourselves coalescing with Indonesia or talking to other Latin American democracies who often have very shared interests with us. And that's not just at a track 2 level, but I do know that the Australian government often finds friends in Latin American countries as well, such as Uruguay, perhaps not at the moment Argentina, but other countries. Chile is a good example of that, where you see these countries grouping together. So you see different relationships come out, and it's not, you know, particularly at that track 2 level, it's not like you're sort of grabbing your US friends and off you go together and try and further your national interests. So it does play out quite differently at that level. And I guess going to your third question, because I could just talk all day on all of these things, about the Sydney dialogue. Now that again cuts across these other 2 questions, because digital tech is the thing to be talking about. I think Ian made a really good point here about what's actually driving our leadership in these areas, and I don't think this is just about technology or digital at this point, but what's driving this is China. So that's inextricably linked. But is it that Australia sees itself as an emerging leader in technology, at the forefront of technology and innovation? I don't think so. And I think that we see that at a domestic level in our political environment as well. That's not really where Australia is at. There were attempts to go down that path in 2015, I think it was 2015, with the National Innovation Statement, and we wanted to see ourselves take on that role. But I think that this is largely driven by that geopolitical environment that we find ourselves in and the global trade environment that we see ourselves in as well. So it's more of a driver. Whereas if you look at technology and digital, that's actually just a broader trend. So it happens to be digital, but I don't think it's a desire to be a leader in that space. Again, if you go out into the G20, ASEAN Track 2 dialogues, most bilateral or trilateral dialogues, technology and digital is on the agenda, and in lots of different formats. So yes, you've got the issues of tech transfer will come up. You'll have digital financial inclusion. In fact, I'm writing a report on that at the moment, on digital and financial inclusion for women and the bottom of the economic pyramid in Asia and policies in that space. So I don't think that that is necessarily something that Australia has gone, we're going to be the leader in this. Lots of multilateral and bilateral arrangements are doing that. And, you know, again, we didn't want to talk about AUKUS, so I won't talk about AUKUS. I also won't talk about the Quad. I guess you've probably got other people to do that. And you see these themes sort of flow from there as well. So I'll probably stop talking there, but I guess they're the sort of the key things that are in response to your question, but I'm happy to tease out more of that if you've got questions about some of those particular points that I've mentioned.
Thank you so much, Erin, for your remarks. You know, one thing that struck me, and I think this is not just Australia's problem. This is a problem that we face in India, and we are a much poorer country per capita wise, which is that there needs to be a lot more funding for track 2 activities, right? And especially track 2 activities involving actors who are either not your best friends or not your worst enemies, because typically my experience in Delhi is that is where we tend to focus a lot of our attention towards. So that is a point very, very well taken. Now, we'll now take questions from the audience. The rules of the game are the following. If you can send in your questions through the Q&A function on Zoom, I will read it out to the relevant panelist, and the panelists can answer in real time. So that is how we are going to do that. But you know, I will abuse my position as the moderator of this webinar and ask all three of you the same question, which is, where do you see Australian foreign policy in 2 decades' time? So the reason I ask is because, again, I don't want to talk about AUKUS. So you and Graham and I, we spent like 40 minutes yesterday talking AUKUS. So so we're going to leave that. But the reason I bring AUKUS is because the last I checked, I think the first SSNs, I think if everything goes well, we are looking at what, 2040 for the first Australian SSNs. So where do you see Australian foreign policy in 2040? What kind of power do you see Australia become, both diplomatically, both domestically? Because, by the way, as you pointed out, the Indian diaspora, for example, in Australia is growing. I suspect that there's the composition of Australian population will change, and that will at some point reflect in your political system, which up to this point, I'm very, very sad to observe is not the case. So where do you see a changed Australia in 20 years as a world actor? And that is for all of you. So we can again go alphabetically, which is we're going to start with I think Erin, and then Ian, and then Kate. I got my alphabet correct. So we can get started on that question.
So we're going reverse alphabetical order. I'll go first. Is that right?
Yeah.
Yep. Okay, cool.
So it's E, I, and K. Now we're
I think
no. So we're not doing last name again. So I just changed the.
Yeah.
I just changed
That's
the
okay.
convention. Changed the convention. Sorry.
You're making us think too much. No, I'm kidding. Okay, really good questions. I love that crystal ball question. Where do you see yourselves in 20 years? And rather than think about predictions, perhaps I would like to comment on what I would like to see in 20 years, addressing two of the points that you make there. So the first one, which might be a little bit of a crystal ball, is I think Australia is going to have a much more diverse trade mix. And we're already seeing, obviously, the push for that with India right now, with the commitment to the trade agreement. So we've got the early document that will be due next month or in December, and then, you know, a finalised agreement next year. Fantastic. But it's not going to replace China. So then we have to start looking elsewhere as well. And one of the areas that I'm particularly interested in, so I've got a personal agenda here, is pushing the trade with Latin American countries as well, because you've got some big economies there that Australia doesn't work with. And we're starting to see that as a country now. In fact, I saw the trade minister yesterday on a Zoom about with the Australian Latin American Business Council, talking about how the Australian government is now starting to look to Latin America as part of that. And I do know last year in a parliamentary inquiry as well, there was an emphasis on countries like Brazil, countries like Mexico, countries like Chile. You know, Chile and Peru are already in APEC, for example, the Pacific Alliance. So that's where the government is going to be making the next moves, I think, outside of the really obvious ones that people are talking about. And that's what I would like to see. We have a lot in common with a lot of the Latin American countries. So that's one thing I'd like to see in 20 years. And the other thing I'd like to see in 20 years that could really influence Australia's foreign policy is our political representation. And you've touched on that, but the Australian diaspora, India is Australia's largest source of migrants now, permanent migrants. They Hindi and Punjabi are the fastest growing languages in Australia, and therefore the religions as well are the fastest growing religions in Australia. Sikhism and Hinduism are the fastest growing. So these are really, really important groups to our country. But we're not seeing the reflection on political representation. And that's not just about India, but across the spectrum of migrants in this country. We're not seeing Chinese representation. I think there's about 1.8 million Chinese origin people. We're not seeing women. We're not seeing multicultural women in Parliament either. And that will influence our foreign policy, because who are going to be the next people out in the world representing Australia? Well, at the moment they don't look like us as a country. And so that's another piece that I'd really like to see in 20 years change for us. I want to change, but that's where we should be in 20 years. I would sooner, but I'll give us 20 years.
I think if I get yes, so Ian got the alphabet right also. So Ian, you
can. So look, I think we all kind of despair a little bit at the lack of diversity. That our parliament doesn't reflect our community, our political class does not reflect our community, our bureaucracy doesn't reflect our community either. And you see it highlighted when you have somebody like Anita Anand, taking over from Harjit Singh in Canada as a defense minister. You can see, it's a different kind of environment. So I'd absolutely like to see that change too. In terms of what Australia wants, there is kind of a concern in Canberra that it no longer has a kind of grand strategic imagination. So we don't have, we're not dreaming up Apex or even Kevin Rudd's Asia Pacific community anymore. Our ambitions have narrowed and they've hardened and they've become more security focused and so on. I don't have so much of a problem about that, so long as we're being kind of creative and clever and maintaining reasonable relationships in the region. Like in the end, what we want is a region that is stable and secure and prosperous, and we need to do what we can to ensure that happens. And that's going to take that is going to take a lot more effort in investment, and it's going to take a lot more creativity and cleverness on Australia's part in term, and it will also take, it will also imply that Australia is going to have to engage, you know, its own, its diasporas, capabilities, languages, cultural understanding, all of those sorts of things. It needs to absolutely needs to diversify its trade and investment interests. I think that's absolutely true. And it's going to have to take on a different kind of security role. So Australia's power, you know, its economic weight and its military power is going to decline in relative terms over the next 20 years. But that also needs to take on a bigger responsibility in the region, because America's relative power and weight is also declining. And if we want to uphold a, you know, a rules-based order, and I think we can argue about the rules, but we probably all would like to see a rules-based order, then we need to take on a different kind of role to the rather passive one that we've taken on in the past. And so imagining what that looks like and making that happen, as well as ensuring Australian prosperity, as well as ensuring that Australia is also a force for good in the region, which it has been in the past in places like Cambodia, and it really needs to be in the future as well. I think those are all big challenges.
All right, thanks so much. You kind of both said what I wanted to say, so how else can we top more inclusive foreign policy? But I think moving forward, it would be great if we just had a better debate within the public about kind of national security, and if we had some sort of national security strategy that was really inclusive of all sectors of Australian society, so our First Nations community, our diaspora, as we kind of look at, you know, the Lowy polls will show that perceptions of the United States might not wane generationally, but they will reign as kind of Australia's demographic changes. And I think that's kind of one of the most interesting things is these demographic changes in Australia. When we talk about security, we're not going to be kind of having these, I think still in Australia, we have these traditional concepts of hard security that see conflict as World War I, World War II, this kind of Cold War conception. But I think increasingly it's going to be climate change in the grey zone area, as we've seen with the kind of Sydney, is that if we just broaden our conception of what security is and who gets to feel secure, whether that's the government, the people in the Pacific region, just kind of expanding our conceptions of security to be not just based on, I think Australia really focuses on economic security. Like we look at our climate change discussions, it's about the economic implications as opposed to the kind of human security issues. So if we broaden our perceptions of security and kind of increase the groups that Australia wants to make feel secure, that's not worded the best, but I think just having more of an HADR and expanding those roles, and not just at the defense level, but a kind of whole of government approach, I think would really help and kind of coordinate the different departments. I think there's like a lack of discussion between departments in Australia's kind of foreign policy apparatus, whether it's the agriculture department working on the UK free trade agreement, just kind of more interdepartmental conversations to make our foreign policy strategies and our national security strategies more aimed and focused.
Thank you so much, all three of you, for you know, trying to look ahead. What I really liked was this point of convergence around the need for diversity, diverse political voices in the national security space, in the foreign policy space, because that is also, by the way, something we also struggle here in India as well. If you look at Indian foreign policy conversations, Indian defense policy conversations, most of it happens here in the National Capital Region. There's barely any discussion around this in smaller Indian states, barring a few examples. So I get the point. I really appreciate this point. At this point, we're going to start taking questions from the audience. I have a couple of them. I think Ian might have answered one question through the chat function. Is that correct, Ian? That you have answered that through a chat function?
Yes, but I'm happy to open it up.
Because that's exactly what I was going to ask you, because that's important. That's important in the sense that what can Australia do to build better ties with Indonesia? Because you know, I don't know who was joking about this. I think it was Rory on Twitter, but it may not be Rory. So it could be somebody else who said that, you know, in the Indo-Pacific, perhaps the Indo should stand for Indonesia, right? So what can Australia do, both in terms of economics and investment, and also in terms of defense ties with Indonesia? Ian, that's for you.
All right, so I'll just to say what's in the chat. So today, Australia has announced a new package of kind of support funding for ASEAN focused projects. It includes a big chunk of money for defense and security things, but also a whole range of other initiatives as well. I can't remember the figure exactly, but we're definitely stepping up our diplomatic engagement across the whole of the region. Indonesia is a very particular case because of its size, because of its weight, because of its importance, and also because of the niggly, somewhat difficult relationship that we've had in the past with that country, both sides being mutual suspicions on both sides as well. I still think the relationship is undercooked and underdone. We have much better, more positive, more confident, more trusting relationships, I think, elsewhere in the region. And I'm not sure that I really understand exactly why that is, but I'm going to pass over to my other panelists to diagnose.
Yeah, so Erin and Kate, feel free to take a stab at this question.
I thought it was really interesting, Ian, how you said, oh, you know, we've invested this money, we're really stepping up, but we've also been doing that for a long time. So this isn't the first, it's not like we've suddenly, you know, delivered an ASEAN step up, for example, and said, you know, here's this bunch of money that we haven't done, you know, haven't invested before. We have been investing a lot in the relationship. And I actually do believe that generally in our political class, there's a lot of support for ASEAN and so on. But on the Indonesia front, like, what's a really practical, pragmatic thing we could do to promote Indonesia? Well, the G20 starts on the 1st of December, and the G20 goes to the Indonesia presidency. What a great opportunity to promote to Australian businesses, to Indonesian businesses. Get half the summit is going to be in person. The B20 is a perfect platform to do that. Now, I haven't heard of any Australian investment in promoting Indonesia's G20 presidency. I could be wrong. I'm not deep enough in the bureaucracy to know that. But from what I do know, which is probably a lot relative to, you know, I'm not saying that. So I think that and this goes back to the point I was making earlier about how Australia engages with the multilateral institutions. Maurice, if you're out there listening, like, investing and amplifying and using these platforms is such a good opportunity for Australia to continue to build and strengthen trade ties in particular, let alone all of the other great things that go along with doing that.
I think, yeah, the Indonesia-Australia relationship, it's always kind of been a thorn in our foreign policy process. I think it kind of also depends on which prime minister they have. We have, you know, Tony Abbott's more Jakarta, less Geneva. We had kind of struggling relations under Howard. And I think Australia has always been, you know, it's a challenge to do with Indonesia from a policy perspective. We've kind of looked at it through, you know, the lens of refugees, through the lens of terrorism, kind of all of the big geopolitical issues, kind of really focus on that bilateral relationship. And I think at the core of kind of some of the issues is that Indonesia deals with its foreign policy in a really multilateral basis. It has ASEAN, it has all of these groups, whereas I think Australia functions a little bit better in the bilateral space, the kind of people to people in terms of how we approach our foreign policy, which I think is quite rare for a middle power. We're kind of really dependent on the international and governance as well. But I think with Indonesia, there's kind of this impasse and lack of understanding on both ends, which have led to a couple of different kind of flaws and issues with the relationship. We have John Howard and the West Papuan refugees. But I think at the base of it and the kind of potential for hope is that people-to-people relations between Australia and Indonesia are consistently quite good comparatively compared to other regions as well. And I think investments in language, I mean, we all are involved with Australian universities. We've seen Asian language kind of decimated in it as well. I'm from country Victoria and we learnt Indonesian, which was like so rare. And I wish I took that opportunity up. Instead, I just learnt French. But I think investing in those people to people, and our university ties are quite strong with Indonesia. We have a lot of Indonesian exchange students and vice versa. We all have friends, we've all traveled to Bali. And I think it's those kind of people to people relations which have remained consistent despite kind of bilateral domestic issues, spying in Timor-Leste, West Papua. I think the people to people has been quite stable, which I think is a good sign.
So the next question that we have in front of us is from a very distinguished Indian naval officer, Vice Admiral Shekhar Sinha, who has asked a tricky but perhaps a predictable question, which is Taiwan. So the scenario goes as following. Xi Jinping wakes up in a bad mood, or PLA generals decide that they are in a bad mood. There is some miscalculation, and you have an attempt by China to forcibly reunify Taiwan with the mainland. What will Australia do in that scenario? I want all three of you to take a stab at it quickly, because I think we are kind of running out of time. So maybe a couple of minutes each on the scenario.
Ian gets to go first, because I don't think he's gone first so far.
Yeah. So yeah, Aaron, you can get started with that. So
look, this is one of these situations where we have to do what we absolutely can to deter a conflict from breaking out, and to make it extremely clear that it would be absolutely devastating and disastrous for all concerned. I think that's really, really imperative, and that means taking risks, sadly. I say that as well because I don't think that militarily and strategically it's actually possible for Australia to not be involved, for a variety of reasons, of sort of technical reasons, that it's almost certainly the case that Australian ships would be in the location somewhere around and about. Australia's things like Pine Gap are crucial to American targeting, as well as surveillance and so on and so forth. And that makes them targets to potential targets for Chinese strikes. It depends on how wide the conflict would become, of course, but I'm not sure that we really have any other choice other than, and the only way in which we could potentially make it a different choice would be a wholesale pullout from the alliance, and out of all the integrated military structures across the region. And I don't think that's a desirable outcome.
Kate, you want to add your thoughts to this?
Yeah, I think agree with Ian. I don't think that we can not do it, but I think there's ways that we can kind of mitigate it before it. Again, we're kind of focusing on our diplomacy as opposed to our defense. But I think because our security architectures are so entwined, and they're only becoming more entwined, kind of, as you said, the kind of trilateral agreement, which we're not talking about. So I think it's increasingly, and Australia again investing in greater own capabilities and these other things, is other ways that we can kind of potentially mitigate, your traditional boots on the ground type of conflict. But I think, yeah, I agree with Ian. I think we're kind of enmeshed institutionally in a way. And I think that's, to the detriment of discussions about Taiwan.
Yeah, great comments from Ian and Kate. And as someone who is not an expert in this, this at all, I think this, the point about deterrence and not going there in the first place and doing whatever we can do really stands out to me. And the other question that I maybe would throw back, not being myself a defense person, is would a conflict with Taiwan happen in the same way that we've seen conflicts in the past, or would it be through other methods, pandemics, non-traditional security, measures? So yeah, so that would be my question back: is would a conflict with Taiwan be fought in the same way that we would understand that? Is this about weapons and bombs, or is it about something else? So that would be, I would actually like to hear other people's views on that.
All right. All right. Well, thank you so much. Erin, your last point fascinates me. Your last point fascinates me for the simple reason that this is something that I and DRI we have been trying to understand a little bit better in terms of how would future scenarios of conflict look like, that goes beyond your usual kinetic engagement that we know and hate, right? But I realize we are past 1 hour, so we have to close this webinar. So thank you, Kate, Ian, and Erin, for your thoughtful insights on the subject. And thank you to our live audience for joining us for the latest episode of Diplomat Risk Intelligence's monthly webinar. As a reminder for our viewers across the world in different time zones, this webinar has been recorded and will be available on the YouTube's Diplomat channel early next week. Thank you so much.